This video provides information about how to install Windows Server 2008 R2. The first step in installing Windows Server 2008 R2 is placing the DVD in the DVD-ROM drive. You also need to configure your computer to be able to boot from the DVD-ROM drive. Many computers are configured to do this by default, but you may have to look at the specific documentation for your computer in order to figure it out. It will be a setting in the BIOS, and in some cases, during the startup process for the computer, you can press F12 in order to select which device you want to start up from, and you want to start up from the DVD drive. Once it starts up from the DVD drive, the first screen you're going to get is this little bit here about asking about languages to install and formatting. So pick whatever is appropriate for your environment. I'm just going to leave it with the default of United States and English. Then click Install Now. The reason I'm demonstrating the installation of Windows Server 2008 R2 rather than Windows 7 is there are some additional steps for the server side install that you don't need to do for Windows 7. So I just want to make sure that we're aware of exactly what we're doing. So for the purposes of Fong's class, we don't need to, we can just use the standard version of Windows. So we'll go with Windows Server 2008 R2 Standard and Full Installation. Server Core does not have a graphical interface, and it's not going to be any fun. We need to accept the license agreement. And for the type of installation, we want to do a custom installation. Anytime you want to do a brand new install, you need to select custom. Now, the trickiest part, where most people might make a mistake from an assignment perspective, is on this screen here where you need to configure the hard drive. As part of your assignment, you need to configure two partitions. So if I were to just select disk 0 and click Next, it would treat the entire drive as one big partition, and after the server's installed, all you'd have is one big C drive. So what I'm going to do is go to Drive Options, and we're going to create a new partition. So our drive is about 128 gigs. So I'm going to create a 64 gig partition. So 64,000 isn't exactly 64 gigabytes, but close enough. And that warning about creating additional partitions is fine. Windows will create a small 100 meg partition, and you can see it there, that it uses for some utility type of stuff as part of the boot process. So we have partition 1 that was automatically created, partition 2, which is the one we're going to install the actual operating system on, and then partition 3, which we'll be able to use to put data on, which is kind of a typical server configuration. So where do we want to install Windows? We want to install Windows on partition 2. And click Next. And then the installation process here is probably going to take all the file copying and stuff like that, usually a good 15 to 20 minutes. After configuring a password for the local administrator, we get to the server desktop, and it comes up and gives us our list of initial configuration tasks. Because we're doing this in a test environment, we will not be activating Windows, so we will skip test 1 or task 1, but we will set the time zone. And we'll just make it our time zone. And we also need to configure networking. So we need to set up an IP address for this computer. So it pops up and our network connection is named local area connection. We'll go into the properties of it. And we want to go to properties of TCP IP version 4. And we're going to use a static IP address, which means we're giving it the IP address. You're probably used to working with individual stuff like laptops, where normally when you connect to a network, it automatically hands it out through DHCP. But we're going to be doing static addresses for our computers. So I'm going to use part of the internal private address range, 192.168, and I'll make mine 5.10. And it automatically fills in the subnet mask for me. So that subnet mask means that we're on the network 192.168.5, and we're computer number 10 on that network. Normally you configure a default gateway, and that default gateway is the router that takes you out to the internet. In our test environment here, we're not going to have connectivity to the internet, so I'm not going to configure a default gateway. And we also need to configure the DNS server. The DNS server is responsible for converting names to IP addresses, and in a Windows environment, it's responsible for helping client computers locate domain controllers. So this computer is going to use itself as a DNS server, because we will be configuring DNS on it. And we're not going to validate these settings because the DNS server doesn't exist yet. So done deal, we've done our basic network configuration. Next up, we're going to configure the computer name. So you can see that it created a randomly generated computer name, and that's not going to work for us. So we're going to change the computer name, and we are going to name it server. Not a terribly creative name, but that's what we'll go with for right now. And after changing the name, it wants to reboot. So we'll let it do its reboot now. This prompt to boot from CD or DVD is there only because the DVD is still in the drive for this computer. If we took the DVD out, it would stop giving us that message every time we restarted. Okay, and it's ready for us to log on. Sorry, because I'm doing this through virtual machines, it's a little more awkward. I'm just going to have to do that. Flip it back. Okay, because this server is going to be kind of in charge of our network, it's going to be a domain controller. The next thing we're going to do is add that domain controller functionality to the computer. So we still have this initial configuration tasks popping up, but we don't actually need to do any more of these tasks. As long as we've done those first three, setting the time zone, configuring the networking, and setting up the computer name, for our purposes, we're good. So I'm going to check this off so it doesn't pop up again and close the window. Then the next thing that's going to pop up for us is a utility called Server Manager. This utility is what we're going to use to complete the configuration of the server. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to click on roles, and roles are the functionality that's built into the server. So we want to add a role that allows it to be a domain controller. So I'm going to add roles, and then we need to pick the role. So the role that allows us to be a domain controller is this one here, Active Directory Domain Services. And when I select it, it pops up saying, hey, in order for that role to be installed, we also need this .NET Framework stuff. So yes, we will add the required features. Click Next, and just keep clicking Next until we can install. And then once this role is installed, we can actually do the domain controller configuration. Alright, done deal. Everything is installed, so we're going to close that up. And I'm also going to close Server Manager because we're not going to use that at this point, not for the moment. And I'm going to open this PowerShell prompt here, which is kind of similar to a command prompt, but kind of a more advanced version that's been added to more recent versions of Windows. And once that starts, I'm going to run DC promo. DC promo is the utility that actually allows me to configure this as a domain controller, so it does the configuration. So it pops up this little wizard here for me. And it's worthwhile to read through some of this information, but I'm guessing for the basics of what we're doing, it's not going to be important. So we are going to create a new domain in a new forest, because we're setting up Active Directory, which is our user and computer information right from scratch. And we're going to create a name for it. So I'm going to name mine. I'll just make mine test.local. So local doesn't exist on the internet, so I'm guaranteed it won't conflict with anything. So that's going to be my domain name. If I had selected a domain name that existed on the internet, like something with a .com or a .ca, I would want to make sure I actually owned that and had control over it. So this forest functional level, again, for what we're going to be doing, just going with the default here of Windows Server 2003 is fine. And ditto with the domain functional level. Some of the more advanced features in Active Directory are only available with higher levels, but for what we're going to be doing, doesn't matter. And on the screen about installing additional options for the domain controller, this is where we can select to make it a DNS server. Notice that's set up by default. And that is what we want, so we will leave that. And it pops up and gives us a warning saying that it isn't able to set up a delegation. Again, for our purposes it doesn't matter, so we're going to continue. It asks us for files locations for some of the files for Active Directory. Again, default locations are good for our purposes. And for our Directory Services Restore Mode Administrator, we need to put in a password. So this is only used for disaster recovery purposes. Again, for what you guys are doing, it isn't going to matter. So it gives us a little bit of a summary here. Click Next. And now it's going to go through the process of finishing off that install. And once the install is complete, it will also reboot the system. And once that reboot is complete, this computer will be our first domain controller in our domain, which means that it can have all of our user accounts and such, and we can start configuring that. Notice that as we log on to the domain now, it actually shows the name of the domain before the administrator name. So that's how we can identify that we're logging on as the administrator account for the domain test. So again, Server Manager is starting by default. That's just kind of a normal thing. We can disable that if we want to. So the first thing I'd like to show you is how to create user accounts and group accounts, because that's going to be kind of the first thing we do before we start configuring security. So I'm going to go to my Start menu, Administrative Tools, and Active Directory Users and Computers. So this is our domain database that is our central source of security on our network. So we've got our domain test.local, and the default location for users and groups is this users container, and the default location for the computer accounts is this computers container. We don't have any users or computers that we've set up yet. Domain controllers, the server that we installed, shows up there. So in users, I'm just going to create a couple of test users. So the delightfully generic Bob Smith, and his logon name is going to be Bob. So when Bob goes to log on, the username he enters is actually Bob. And I'm going to set him up with a password. Then for my purposes, I'm actually going to turn this option to force the user to change the password off. In most real-life environments, you would actually leave that on because you want the user to change the password to something specific to them. And I'll create another one called Susan. And same deal here. Okay, we've got a couple of users, and so basically people are able to log on to those user accounts because they're part of the domain now. Cool. So the other thing that is worthwhile noting here is we can also create groups. So I'm going to create a marketing group. So this is something that you'd typically find in any organization, right? They've got marketing, and marketing people need to be assigned access to certain resources. So what I would do is create a group named marketing. I'm going to put people that are in part of the marketing department into that group, and then I can assign the group access to resources. It's a lot easier than managing this stuff by saying Bob gets access, Susan gets access, Jeff gets access, Jason gets access, that kind of thing. So I can manage it all based on groups instead of individual user accounts. So the type of group I'm going to create, the group scope here, really doesn't matter in the small environment that we've got. So I'm going to stick with the default of global group. Now the group type does matter. We need this to be a security group because only security groups can be assigned access to resources. This distribution option is only relevant for email systems. So we created the marketing group, and I'm just going to go into the properties of it. And when I go into the properties of it, I have a members tab, and I'm going to add Bob and Susan. And notice there's a semicolon between both of those names. I'll click check names just to make sure the system can find them properly. And it does. I'll click OK, and Bob and Susan are now both members of the marketing group. So whatever permissions I give to the marketing group, Bob and Susan get those permissions. And that really is all there is to the basics of creating user accounts and group accounts. There's a lot more things that you can do with user and group accounts, but that is the absolute basics. You need to be able to create the user so people can log on, give them a password, and generally speaking, make them a member of groups and assign groups access to resources like parts of the file system. So let me show you how to set up some of the file system security things. So I'm going to close Active Directory users and computers. And just to make this a little bit easier, in Server Manager in my roles, I'm going to add the file server role. Now I don't need all the functionality that this is going to add, but just makes it a little easier. So file services, and next. And it's asking about role services inside of file services. So this is basically subcomponents. For what we're doing, we don't need any of these subcomponents. There's a whole lot of functionality on the server side that we're just not going to touch here. So file server is the only one we need. And install it. Now this one's going to be pretty quick by comparison, and it won't require a reboot afterwards. Done deal. So now I'm going to close Server Manager, and we're going to create what's called a file share. So I'm going to open up Windows Explorer, and I'm going to go into my computer. Oh, and actually, sorry, before we do that, we need to configure that data drive. So we never did finish configuring the partitions on the disk. So we created the first partition that was going to be our C drive, but we didn't create the one that's going to be for our data. So I'm going to go back to Server Manager. And inside of Server Manager, I'm going to go to Storage and Disk Management. And you can see in Disk Management, we've got Disk 0, which represents our physical disk. We've got that 100 meg partition and the C drive that were already created. But we've got about 64 gigs here that's unallocated already still. So I'm going to right click on it and New Simple Volume. Again, that's all we need at this point. And it's going to default to being the full size of the remaining disk, and that's fine for what we're doing. And we need to pick a drive letter for it. So D drive is already being taken by our DVD, so E drive is fine. We'll leave it as that. And I'm going to change the volume label though, so it's a little more easily identifiable. I'm going to call it data. And I'm going to leave this option on for a quick format because it makes quite a big difference to time. And for file system here, we definitely want NTFS. NTFS file system lets us set up security permissions for users and groups. If we picked the FAT file system, it does not. So NTFS is the default, and we're going to go with it. And it's going to go through its formatting process, and it'll just be complete in a minute here. Again, quick format, much faster than if we'd done full format. Alright, done deal. Formatting is complete, and we have our E drive. So now I'm going to close up Server Manager again. And you can see under my computer we've got the E drive, and I am going to create a new folder called shared data. So I'll just call it shared. And I'm going to create another one called users, and we're going to actually use both of those. So the shared data will be for use by multiple parts of our organization, and the users one will be used for just home folders where people will have their private storage. So let me go with the users one first, because I think that's a little easier to understand. Well, maybe not easier to understand, but a little less complex for our initial setup. So I'm going to create this users folder, and I'm going to go into the properties of it. And even though we're creating what's called a shared folder, we do not want to use the share with option. That share with option is a wizard that does things we aren't going to like. So we're going to go into properties, and we're going to go to the sharing tab, and we're going to manually set up our share. Nope, sorry, that's the wizardized version. Sorry, we're going to go into advanced sharing. And we're going to manually create our share. And the share name will be users, so that's what we'll see on the network as the share name. And we need to check out the permissions. And we are going to, for share permissions, give everyone full control. And that's totally appropriate for what we're doing. So that's going to create the share. Now, the way you can think of a share is kind of like opening up a window onto a server. It doesn't control what we can do with the files inside the share, it just sets our maximum permissions. So if I give you full control to the share for everyone, that doesn't mean that everyone is going to be allowed to do everything they want to all the files inside, but it means that everyone could potentially, if they're given permissions to the file, do so. So just to keep life simple, for your share permissions, always go full control everyone. Now the file system level permissions are on this security tab, and we want to modify these because by default what's happening on this drive is that all users get read access, and if we're going to be storing people's private home folders in here, actually no, for our purposes actually that will work just fine here. I think we'll modify it on the other share. So I'm going to close this. So all users have read access to that users folder. They won't get read access to the subfolders. And we'll close that. And now I'm going to go back into Active Directory users and computers. So I could manually create individual folders for users inside of here. And if I did, then what would happen is I would have to manually configure the security. Now the easier way is to let the system configure the security for me, and we can do that in Active Directory users and computers. So I am going to go to Bob here and go to the properties of Bob, and he has a profile tab, and this profile tab is an easy place we can set up a home folder for a user. So I'm going to go with M drive, and we need to tell M drive where it points to. So I'm going to start this with a double backslash. This is what's called a UNC path, and the first part of a UNC path is the server name. So we created a server named server because I am that creative. So that's the first part, and then we need to put the share name. So we created a share named users on the server. Now because Bob's home folder does not already exist, so I'm creating a subdirectory there for Bob. As soon as I click OK, it's going to realize that the Bob's folder doesn't exist, and it's going to ask me, do you want me to create it for me? And what it will do is it'll set up the permissions properly for Bob automatically. Oh, pardon me, it didn't even ask. So let's see if it created the folder the way it was supposed to. It did create the folder the way it was supposed to. Sorry, earlier versions actually asked whether it should create the folder for me. Now if I look at the properties of this folder and go to the security tab, we can check out the permissions here. So Bob has full control to his own folder. That seems reasonable. Administrators have full control. Again, seems reasonable. but all other users still have read access. So you know what? I was thinking we wouldn't have to modify that, but we are going to have to modify that. So let's go back up to the users folder, because what ends up happening is when, let's go back up to the users folder here, pardon me, or up to data. And because what ends up happening is if I apply security permissions to the, or if there's certain permissions at the users folder, they flow down to the subfolders inside it. So we want to stop those from flowing. So we're going to go to the security here, and we need to go to advanced. And so on the users folder, we need to change permissions, and we need to stop those inheritable permissions from flowing down. So I am going to remove all of the permissions, and we'll manually add what we want. So we will add administrators, and administrators we are going to give full control to this folder, subfolders, and files. And we're also going to add domain users, and for them we are going to give list folder and read data, and traverse folder execute file, and that should be sufficient. And we're not going to have it this folder and subfolders, it's going to be this folder only. So effectively what that means is that users are going to be able to see what's inside of the users folder, but they will only see the subfolder, or they will only be able to go into the subfolders that they have access to. So the permissions are not going to flow down below. So one of the things we can do to test this, now that those permissions have been applied, so we can go to this effective permissions tab, and it will tell us what permissions somebody has. So we'll go take a look, and for Bob, or sorry, we don't want to test that here. Cancel out of it. And OK. So if we go inside there to the Bob folder, and we go to the Security tab, and Advanced, and Effective Permissions, we can verify that Bob has access to this. So Bob has full control, and Susan, who's a regular user, should not have access to Bob's folder. And you can see that Susan has no access to Bob's folder. So we have in fact set it up exactly the way we wanted it to. And then any other users, when we added that home folder, their folder would automatically appear also. Now in terms of manually setting up something like that, so let's say we've got this shared folder here, and we've got different department stuff in it. We go through pretty much the same process. So inside of shared, I want to create some new folders. So I'll create a folder for marketing, and I'll create a folder for accounting. And the same thing applies. Marketing people shouldn't have access to accounting stuff. Accounting people shouldn't have access to marketing stuff. So the only difference is I'm going to have to assign the permissions manually for accounting and marketing. So I'm going to start by going to shared and going into the security, and I will go to the advanced stuff again, and we will block the inherited permissions. So we'll change it, block the inherited permissions, remove everything that was already there, and then we're going to add administrators, and we will give administrators full control, and we will add domain users, and they will get traverse folder and list folder. So again, they'll just be able to see what's inside. And then, so we've done that on shared. Now if we go to the marketing folder, and you can see domain users. Oh, you know what? I forgot to block the inheritance on that. So sorry, I'm going to go back, security, advanced, and this one for domain users, change the permissions, and edit the one for domain users, because that shouldn't flow. So it should be this folder only. So when we get to marketing and go into the security there, only administrators have access. So we want to edit that, and we're going to add the marketing group. And for the marketing group, we'll give them modify. So normally you give users on your network only modify permissions. That lets them modify files, delete files, add files, but it doesn't let them modify the actual permissions or access to stuff, whereas full control would give them the ability to give other people access. And then we would do the same thing for accounting. We'd add the accounting group and give them modify permissions. And the one thing we still have not done is shared out that folder. So go to the properties again, share it, go to advanced sharing. We can call it shared. By default, it picks the same name as whatever the folder was, and that works for me. And the permissions, again, we're going to give everyone full control because those file system permissions actually limit what people can do. So, done deal. That's most of what we need to know about giving people access to these files. So when I configured the home folder, we set it up so that M drive was the drive that pointed at the person's home folder, and we would set that up individually for each person. We also want to set it up so that users have easy access to that shared folder. So we need to map a drive letter for them there also. So a couple of different ways we can do it. One is with a logon script. At this point in time, that's kind of an old school way to do it. So rather than doing it through a logon script, but you certainly still could create a batch file, set it up, and there's lots of documentation on Google about how to do that. I'm going to show you a slightly different way to do it called group policy preferences. So group policy is settings that you can push out to users and computers. And I'm going to go into a utility called Group Policy Management. And you can see that it's hooked up to our test.local domain. Expand the domain, expand test.local, and inside of there's two policies that exist by default. One called default domain policy, and that applies to everyone in the organization and all computers in the organization. And another one here that's linked to default, called default domain controllers, that only applies to the domain controllers that are inside that domain controllers folder, or organizational unit being the proper term. So what I'm going to do, just to show you a quick little bit about group policy, is I'm going to create a new group policy object that is linked to the test.local domain, so it applies to everyone, and I'll show you how to get that map drive letter working. So I'm going to right-click the domain and create a group policy object in the domain and link it here. And I'm going to call it drive mapping. And once I have created that, I am going to edit it. And the setting I want is related to users. So I'm going to go into the preferences down here, and I'm going to go into, I think it is control panel. Let me double check. Nope, sorry, Windows settings. There we go. And we've got one called drive maps. So if I want to set up a drive mapping that points to that shared folder, right click, new map drive. And the action of update will create it if it doesn't already exist, so that works. And what do I want to map it to? I want to map it to server, and shared was the share name. And I want to select a specific drive letter because everybody should be the same. So I'm going to go with S for shared. Again, I am that creative. We don't want to use this connect as stuff. All the users connect just as their regular selves. And that's it. So we just specify the letter and what it's going to connect to. Done deal. And that little yellow triangle is just indicates that it's an update action. So the color does not indicate there's an error or anything like that. It's just because the action is update, it's a yellow triangle. If it's replace, it's red, if I remember correctly, or delete, it's a different color. So, and that is all there is to setting up that letter through a drive map. I'll show you real quick the logon script stuff. For users, it's in policies and Windows settings and scripts. And logon script is the one we would want. And what you can do here is if you wanted to do a traditional logon script with a batch file, you would go into this show files and create the batch file here. So I'll just create a quick little text file. And I'm going to edit this. And so if you were going to do it through a drive mapping in here, the command you would use is net use and then the drive letter and then what you wanted to connect it to. Oops, sorry, typo there. Sorry, it would be net use, then the drive letter and then the share you want to connect it to. And then the other thing you would need to do is right now Windows is being sneaky, and Windows, if we look at the properties of it, it's actually a .txt file. So we would need to go in and rename that so it actually is a .bat file. So if you press Alt, because I'm not sure why Windows hides file extensions all the time. So if I press Alt, go to Tools, Folder Options, View, we can get rid of that hiding extensions for known file types, which drives me a little bit nuts. And then I can rename it with the .bat at the end. And we're good to go. Now that can run as a login script. And we can browse for it. So at that point, we're now telling it, for everybody that logs on to the domain, you should run testscript.bat. Now, I'm actually going to cancel out of this so it doesn't save the setting, because I've already set up the group policy preference for drive mapping. In your instructions, I believe it says to use a logon script, but so you can go at it this way, or if Phong gives you permission, feel free to use the group policy preference as well, because that would be the more modern way of doing it. So more modern as in within the last 2 years or so. Oops, sorry, I was going to not save that, and I did. So I'm just going to remove that and then not worry about it. So there's all sorts of other settings you can push out through group policy. Basically, in a corporate environment, you lock pretty much everything down. Users don't have the ability to modify much on their own computers. Well, much as you would have seen in a computer lab. Now, the one other thing to show you on the server side is creating a shared printer. So again, I don't have a physical printer to install for you, but I can show you the basic process involved. So if I go to Devices and Printers, Absolute Basic Printer Configuration, I'll just right-click in here and add a printer. And I'm going to add a local printer. And I'm going to use an existing port, LPT1. Again, from a real-world perspective, we would probably, under normal circumstances, be actually creating a new port and creating an IP port to print directly over the network to an IP printer. So I'm just going to pretend it's hooked up to a local parallel port. In your test lab, I'm not sure what the configuration is. It may in fact be a local printer that is shared off the server, which would be likely LPT1. And I'm just going to pick a random printer, so just the first one in the list. From a real-world perspective, you would have given it the specific printer driver for the specific printer that you are configuring for your users. So whatever matches the real physical printer. And I am going to share it. And I'm going to call it Brother Printer. And I'm not going to print a test page because, again, I don't have a real physical printer. And done deal. There it is. And it's also my default. So that is all of the configuration from the server side. We've seen how to set up file system security. We've seen how to create user accounts. We've seen how to set up groups. We've seen how to set up drive mappings. We've seen how to set up printers and how to share things out. So next up on our list is setting up the Windows 7 computer that is going to connect to this. So this is our Windows 7 computer. I've already done the install of it, but I have not done any of the configuration other than during the initial startup it asked for stuff like the time zone and a username and a computer name. So what we need to do first is we need to set up networking on this. So we already set up the server as 192.168.5.10, so it's on that 192.168.5 network. Now we need to configure networking for the client so it's the same. One of the things in Windows 7 is you don't really need to remember where any of the settings are. You just kind of type everything in the search bar and whatever you need usually pops up. So we want Network and Sharing Center, because that's where all my network configuration is done. And we want Local Area Connection. And we want to go into the properties of that. And we want IP version 4 properties. So again, we're going to set this all up static. In the real world, most client computers get it dynamically from DHCP, but for our test environment, this works. So I'm going to do 192.168.5 dot, and so 10 was already used by the server, so really anything else can be used by the client. So I'm just going to go with 100. Again, no default gateway because we don't have internet connectivity. And DNS is the address of our server. So we say OK to all of that. And next up, we want to change our computer name, and we also want to join the domain. So the easiest way to get there is just right-click Computer and go to Properties. So actually, you know what? Our computer name is named Byron PC. That's fine for our purposes right now. But again, from a lab perspective, you'd go with whatever is appropriate for your lab environment. Now, before you go through the domain joining process, which links the security of our workstation with the server, you might want to verify that you're able to communicate with that server. So that's what I'm going to do. So I'm just going to open up a command prompt. And I'm going to ping 192.168.5.10 because I know that was the address of my server. And it responds back, so I know that it's up and alive for sure. Just to be aware, domain controllers respond to pings. Windows 7 computers do not by default respond. So if you were to try this pinging from the server side to the Windows 7 side, it would fail. And that's not indicating that you don't have connectivity. It's indicating that just it doesn't respond to pings. So don't assume that it's a guarantee of connectivity. So I'm going to change settings so I can join the domain. So on the computer name tab, I'm going to change, and we want to join the domain. And the domain name was test.local. Took me a moment to remember. And we'll click OK. So as soon as we do this, it's going to ask us for credentials that exist at the domain level to say, hey, who says you have permission to join this domain? So you can see that the logon name is for in the test.local domain. I'm going to use administrator. And once we have, so it takes a minute or so here to join the domain, then we need to do a reboot before the join is complete. So we'll restart our Windows 7 machine. So what joining the domain buys us is once a computer is joined to the domain, the user accounts that we created on the domain controller are able to log on to that computer. So that's what pulls the Windows 7 computer and makes it part of the security system for the domain. So I'll show you coming up in just a minute once it finishes rebooting. But what it does as part of this process is all domain users are now going to be members of a local group named users on this computer, and all domain administrators are a member of the local group administrators on this computer. So what that means is anybody who's set up as a user in the domain can log on. Anybody who's set up as an administrator in the domain is allowed to actually modify this computer and administer it. So when it has Byron PC at the beginning like this, it means it's logging on as a local user account that exists only on the Windows 7 machine. That user account will not have access to any of the server level resources like the shared printer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch user, and actually I am going to log on to the test domain as Bob, because he was the user account we set up and gave permission to do everything and gave the home directory and all that. So if you're interested in it, I'm going to show you how to manually install that shared printer, but those group policy preferences that I configured for the drive mapping, those group policy preferences can also push out the shared printer directly to the workstation also. So the first time a user logs on, it does some setting configuration for that specific user. So it's called creating the user profile. Alright, so we're up and alive. We logged in as Bob. So just the very fact that Bob was allowed to log in, that shows you that the security is integrated now between the domain and this workstation. So now the big test. If I open up my Windows Explorer here, I want to see that S drive that we pushed out through the group policy, and S drive is there. And you can also see that Bob's home folder is there. So both of those were connected. So again, Bob's home folder, we did all the configuration for that inside of his user account. And the S drive for the shared folder, we pushed out through the group policy preferences. Now in terms of setting up the printer, the easy way is I'm just going to browse that shared printer. I'm just going to browse to it off of the server. So I'm just going to do /server and browse across the network, and this shows me everything that's available on the server. And you can see one of those is Brother Printer. If I double click it, it's actually going to install it on my local workstation. And it automatically downloads the driver from the server and puts it down onto the workstation. So done deal, you can see it there. And if I go into my printers now, you can see that the Brother Printer on server is there. It's even set up as my default printer. And if we had a live environment here, I could print test pages. I could, again, it's just shared and ready to go. Done deal, nice and easy. So the only other thing I wanted to show you is just that integration of security between the client computer and the server. So the way to do that is in computer management, and we'll see if Bob has permission to view that information. He doesn't have permission to modify it, but he might have permission to view it. Oh, and no, Bob does not. So I am going to, so we'll give the administrator password in order to be able to have access to the utility. So because I gave the administrator account information there, when this window for computer management pops up, it actually is running as administrator. So you can see inside, I've got the settings here, local users and groups. So the local groups that I have, well, here I had a local user named Byron that was created during the install process. Administrator and guest are created automatically during install, but they're disabled. And for groups, these are again all created automatically by the system as part of install, but the two main ones are administrators and users. Administrators can do whatever they want. They have full control over the system. Users have just basic access, so they can work with stuff in My Documents, but they can't add or remove programs. So it's typical for people to be users on their systems rather than administrators, unlike a home computer where you're kind of king of the hill, so to speak. So if I take a look at this users group that exists locally only on this computer, there's a member called domain users, and that's what gives all the domain users, such as Bob, the ability to log on here. And if I go to the administrators group and look at the members, you can see that the domain admins for the domain test are configured as a local administrator. So that's what would give my domain administrator account the ability to configure every workstation in the environment. And I think that should be enough information to get you through your activity. Just remember, Google is your friend. One of the nice things about working with Windows is that there is a ton of information about configuring Windows on the internet. But I believe I've covered all the basics you guys should require as part of your activity. Not exactly in the order you need to do it necessarily, but the whole process, joining the domain, setting up the user accounts, group accounts, file permissions, shared printer, that's the whole deal. So you should have two DVDs, the Windows 2008 R2 DVD as well as the Windows 7 DVD, the exact ones I used in this demo actually. And when you install them, neither one of them are going to ask you for a product key, and you're just going to run them in eval mode. So basically both of them would cease working after a brief period of time.